I started out with a summary of what we had talked about already this quarter. December the 7th, we talked about who qualifies under the Internal Revenue Code as a minister to be taxed and to receive the benefits of taxation as a minister. On the 14th of December, we talked about is the minister self-employed or an employee, and we talked about the 20 that the IRS would look at if they were trying to make a decision in a particular case. On the 21st, we talked about issues around electing out of Social Security and Medicare. Last week, we talked about what is income to the minister and how is it reported for tax purposes. And tonight, we're talking about maximizing the benefit of the housing allowance. So let me share the PowerPoint screen and get back to the top here. All right. The housing allowance is found in Section 107 of the Internal Revenue Code. In 1971, the IRS, absent any action from Congress, imposed an additional requirement that the housing allowance not exceed the fair rental value of the furnished home versus utilities. And in response to the Warren case, and we'll see the Warren case, a few details of it in a moment, the Clergy Housing Allowance Clarification Act of 2002 was enacted. In the Warren case, a 2000 case, Rick Warren, I believe, was the gentleman under audit here, was audited by the IRS, and the IRS threw out the 1971 regulations regarding the fair rental value test, and instead a three-judge panel out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based in California, raised issues regarding the constitutionality of the housing allowance. So this is probably as good a time as any to have a discussion about the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And by the way, as I said earlier, in 2002, Congress passed the law and put into the law the fair rental value, and we'll have three different numbers that we'll look at when we determine how much of the housing allowance is exempt from income tax. And that fair rental value test will be one of those three. Have either of you heard of the Freedom from Religion Foundation?
I've heard of it. I don't know much about it.
Okay. Yes. They're a company that's based out west, Wyoming or Minnesota or somewhere out west. They have filed a variety, and you can go to their website, frf.org or something like that. I forget exactly what their website is. But one of their first filings was a lawsuit against the IRS because the IRS automatically deems churches to be tax-exempt 501c3 organizations without them having to file anything. Well, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, in order to get a tax-exempt status, had to file a form. It's either a 1023 or a 1024 form, depending on which section of the tax-exempt law you're trying to get exempted under. So that was one of their first filings, was a lawsuit against the IRS for accepting or deeming churches to automatically be tax-exempt organizations without having to file the form. In 2009, I believe it was, they filed a suit against the IRS again and against the Treasury Department for allowing ministers to receive housing allowance and not be taxed on that income. In 2011, that suit got thrown out by federal court because, well, let me give you the full story here. The judge who initially heard the suit agreed that they had a legitimate basis for their suit, and his ruling was reviewed by a circuit court, which threw it out because he ruled that they had no legal standing to bring suit. From that standpoint, they changed what they were doing, and their foundation started paying them a housing allowance. They filed amended returns or filed tax returns for 12, 13, 14, 15, where they were being paid housing allowance by their foundation. And then they filed amended returns trying to exempt that housing allowance from income. So in the IRS, with no explanation, gave them a refund for 12, but for 13, ultimately said that they were not allowed a housing allowance because they weren't ministers. And the law plainly says that you have to be a minister in order to qualify to receive a housing allowance. So they reinstated their suit, and October of last year, the same judge that granted them right to sue first time and got reversed in the circuit court granted them summary judgment that yes, they were correct, and that housing allowance is a non-constitutional thing. So just be aware that as we go through and have this discussion, there is something out there ongoing from a legal standpoint about whether or not this is legally allowed under the Constitution. I have no idea how the courts will hold this, but because it is, establishing religion, quote unquote, is how this particular judge ruled. All right, let's talk about what can be covered by housing allowance. As a general rule, you're aware of all the normal things. If you're renting a place, your rent. If you're owning a place, your monthly mortgage, both principal and interest. And if you're paying escrows for real estate and insurance, or property taxes and insurance, then those amounts would also be allowed as a housing allowance amount. All your utilities, your electric, your gas, your sewer, your water, your trash, your cable TV, your telephone, your firewood. I say telephone, and that would be a landline. There's probably less argument for a cell phone than there would be for a cable TV or a telephone. And from that standpoint, internet would be allowable as a utility as well. Other things that are normal issues around the house: pest control, household cleaning supplies, maintenance for the house or the yard, any lawn service you have. When I talk household cleaning supplies, that's anything that you buy: a mop, a broom, a Comet cleanser, Windex, shower stall spray. I mean, whatever you're using as household cleaning supplies would be qualified there as under housing allowance, or to be covered by your housing allowance. Any homeowner's insurance, coverage against fire, theft, and liability, any real estate taxes. And we noted on the previous screen that your mortgage interest and your real estate taxes here are both still fully deductible on Schedule A. That's the way the law is written. You get to exclude it from income, but you also get to deduct the mortgage interest and the real estate taxes. Any insurance on your furnishings, any umbrella liability insurance you have that is part of the house, and the house insurance would be a leg of that umbrella liability insurance. If you live in a community that has housing, a homeowners association or a condo owner association, any HOA or COA dues or fees would be covered or could be covered by your housing allowance. There are some other items. For example, if you buy a new house, the down payment, the real estate commissions, the attorney fees, any escrow fees, any points you paid, any origination costs, all those things related to the purchase of a new home would qualify. New furniture, new furnishings, new appliances, new plates, utensils, cookware, cups, all those things would qualify to be covered by your housing allowance. Any carpeting, any curtains, any drapes, any linens, any pictures, wallpaper, paint, keys, etc., any repairs or maintenance, improvements, landscaping, fencing, any special assessments made for street sewers or sidewalks, all those kinds of things qualify to be covered by your housing allowance. Any questions so far on all this litany of stuff that we've added, issued about, talked about?
Would you need copies of all the receipts for all that stuff in order to write it off?
Let's hold that question for just a minute until we get around to where we determine what the numbers are. But yes, okay. As a general rule, yes, anything that you did, if you should get audited, you would need to document where you came up with your numbers. And for example, when I said keys or repair or maintenance, if you replace the locks, new locks, anything you're doing repair or maintenance or to the house and eating in the house and using the house as a place to live, furniture, furnishings, appliances, dishwashers, clothes washers and dryers, you name it. If you put in an ice machine, all those things, plates and utensils, and whether you're buying disposable things, they still would qualify. So all those kinds of expenses can add up for your housing allowance. All right, what are the rules that we need to deal with when we designate a housing allowance? First, it has to be an agreement in writing. Well, has to be an agreement prior to any monies being designated, and writing is preferred. We'll look at some court cases in a little bit where they didn't have it in writing, but the agreement has to be there prior to any monies being designated as housing allowance. The best thing to do is to have it done once a year, every year, around sometime in December for next year. If you need to change it, you can change it, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The allowance cannot exceed the reasonable compensation of the minister. We'll look at an interesting court case on that. The deduction cannot exceed the fair rental value of the furnished home, excuse my typo there, plus any utilities. Now, that is two of the numbers that we'll deal with. And the third number we'll deal with is the actual expense that you incurred. So the first number we deal with is the amount that was agreed to as housing allowance. The second number we have to deal with is the fair rental value of the furnished home plus utilities. Now, fair rental value of the furnished home, that could be interpreted as, do I go out and rent this as a furnished home? Or it could be interpreted as, do I rent it as an unfurnished home and then rent the furnishings? That latter is probably an aggressive stance, and I don't know if you did that and the IRS audited you that they would agree with that. So the more conservative process is, what would it be renting for as a furnished home plus whatever utilities you have? How do you come up with that number? The best way, probably, if you've got a real estate agent in your congregation, is go to them and say, I just need to know what this house would rent for as fair rental value. Some people will say, well, I just take 1% of the value of the house, and that's what I use. 1% a month or 12% for a year. That's an iffy, I'd feel better if I were doing a tax return where I had something better than that, that would be utilized as the fair rental value of the home. If you don't have a real estate agent in your congregation, if you know one, you could always ask somebody, and most real estate agents, if you tell them what you need, they'll generally help you out as best they can. You might just check places that are being rented around your house to find out what that is. But that's one of the numbers that you need to come up with when we deal with this. The last point on this slide is the amount of the allowance can be adjusted by mutual agreement of the parties at any point in time. The only caveat being that it can only be done, dollars can only be designated prospectively, i.e. future dollars. So if you came in and you saw that your housing allowance, for example, that your wife's been nagging you to buy new furniture, and lo and behold, yeah, we probably need to do that, so let me go get a housing allowance increase. You can make that adjustment, you can increase that number, and that then you can cover that, but it can only be designated as part of the monies you get paid on an ongoing, a future basis, a prospective basis. You can't retroactively reclassify something that was not housing allowance when it was paid to you as housing allowance. The audit guide for ministers, the IRS audit guide for ministers, states that the housing allowance exclusion only applies if the employing church designates the amount of the parsonage allowance in advance of the tax year. That's not what the law says. And I suspect if they audited you and said, no, you didn't have that until January, so I'm going to disallow anything from housing allowance, and you went to court about that issue, you would most likely win, because the law says you can set it at any point in time, and you can use those numbers prospectively, and you can adjust it at any point in time and use the adjusted number prospectively. So that, if you ever run into an issue being audited about housing allowance, you need to be aware that their audit guide says that it has to be designated before the tax year begins, but that is not what the law says. As I say, that's not in accordance with the Internal Revenue Code or the regulations, which allows that designation at any time as long as it's applied prospectively. Let's look at some court cases. Kaiser versus Commissioner, a tax court memo case in 1992. The minister was allowed a tax-free housing allowance even though the designation was done orally with a written record of the event much later. Most people that are dealing with this issue recommend that there be something in minutes of the meetings of the church, either the eldership or the men's meeting or whatever, designating that amount. That would give you the writing documentation, the written documentation of what's going on, such that you could then utilize that as housing allowance. Logie versus Commissioner, 98 tax court memo case. He was not allowed a housing allowance because no evidence of the designation could be proven by the minister. So those two cases seem to be just the opposite of each other, but the difference here is that in Kaiser, he was able to prove to the satisfaction of the tax court that it had been allowed, and the designation was just documented later, whereas in Logie, he was not even able to prove that it had been allowed orally, much less documented. So the best thing to do is to get something in writing. And we've got one of our ministers that every year will send us something, and before we pay our first January payroll in December, he sent us a form that he wants all of us as elders to sign. And it's his method, his wife's method of making sure they've got documentation of the housing allowance being designated. So it's such an important thing to him that he just wants that. And I understand it is important to show that documentation. In Holmes versus Commissioner, a 2010 tax court case, we had a minister whose annual salary was $13,500, of which $13,000 was designated as housing allowance. This man was audited by the IRS, who claimed he had not proven how much he spent on housing, not that too much of his salary was designated as housing allowance. So it can be any number from 0 up to 100% of your salary, as long as your salary is reasonable, and whatever is designated is one of those three numbers that we'll deal with. In this particular case, in 2010, the tax court held for the minister that he had proven how much was spent on housing. So back to your question earlier, do I need those receipts? You're better off if you get audited, if you have the receipts and can prove what your expenses were as far as your housing allowance. But you're proving you've got to prove all three numbers. Number one, how much was designated. Number two, how much was spent. And number three, how much the fair rental value of your house is, furnished plus utilities.
So this is something that has to be agreed on. Like in my situation, I don't know if anybody in my congregation even knows about a housing allowance.
I understand. And the first time I ever taught this class, we had a gentleman who's been a minister for many years, well over 20 years. And his tax preparer had no knowledge of a housing allowance, no understanding of a housing allowance, no concept of what was going on. So he only worked part-time as a minister. He worked another W-2 job, but he worked part-time as a minister. And my recommendation to him was he basically take 100% of what he's getting paid and put it in as housing allowance. And that just takes, in essence, as long as he spends that on his housing, that just takes whatever his ministerial income is off the table as far as income tax is concerned.
That's kind of where my situation would be, but I've had no previous agreement for any of that, so I guess I couldn't use that for this last year.
You could not use it for 2017, nor could you use it for anything you've been paid yet in 2018. So my encouragement would be to get that agreement as quickly as possible, and preferably in writing, and have, if whatever you're getting paid is not enough to cover your cost of housing, those things we talked about earlier, designate 100% of your salary to be housing allowance.
Yeah, because my rent is more than my monthly income from ministerial work, so it would just all go to that.
Absolutely, yeah. Do 100% of it as housing allowance. That will bring up one little minor complication. If you remember back when we talked about employee versus self-employed, and yes, the minister should get paid on a W-2, and the only numbers that show on that W-2 are box 1, the salary amount, net of the housing allowance, and box 14, the housing allowance amount. If all your salary is going to housing allowance, then there's nothing to go in box 1. All of it would go in box 14. And the IRS probably would not want you to file, or the church to file, a W-2 and a W-3 with box 1 at 0.
Well, now everything that I've gotten up to this point has been a 1099
Okay.
from them, so I don't know how that would affect.
And here's my question on the 1099, and we talked briefly about that when we talked about the 1099, those churches that pay ministers on a 1099. There's nowhere on there to designate housing allowance.
Yeah.
They give you a 1099, what number are they going to use? Are they going to use everything they paid you? And then are they going to send that 1099 to the IRS? Then you got a problem. Because the IRS, the first thing they're going to do when they process your tax return is try to match that 1099 with what you put on your tax return. And when I have clients that received an erroneous 1099, I'll put it on the tax return because I know that's what's going to happen. And then I'll put some offsetting expense on the tax return and document why I'm doing it. So if the IRS does more than just that base computer match for that return, they can understand what we did. I'll put a statement in there to the effect of, this 1099 was received by us, but it should not have been, this type of income, or it wasn't our income, or something like that. And here's what we've done with that money. So I put, as a tax preparer, I put those things on the return. But if they pay you a 1099, what number are they going to put there? See, they've got an issue they've got to deal with, determining what the right number is. Now, they can put the full amount they paid you and then give you a letter or some sort of documentation that says, out of this amount we paid you, so much was housing allowance.
So it can be worked around. It's just a lot.
It can be worked around. There's just issues that if they issue you a 1099 and you don't put it on your tax return, you're going to have a problem, almost guaranteed problem, because the first thing the IRS does when they process returns is match them to 1099s and W-2s and all those things. And the computer doesn't match.
Then they're going to see, oh, he's got all this extra income that he didn't report.
Right. And that's their first thought. They send you a letter. The computer generates a letter. No employee does anything here. The computer does it all. The computer sends you a letter and says, we think your tax return should say this. And they're not going to give you any exemption for that income or housing allowance. So you've got the issue then of saying, no, that's not right. Here's what really happened.
So it's got to be kind of, for that situation, both parties have to really work together to figure out what to do with the 1099. And
if you've got a treasurer there that needs to have a 5-minute phone conversation with me, that's fine.
At the moment, our treasurer actually just broke her back and is going to be in the nursing home for the next foreseeable future. So I don't know. We're kind of in the process of talking to everybody and seeing if anybody else wants the position or like that. But definitely, I'll definitely have to sit down and have a conversation with them.
Yeah, this is something you definitely need to work through, because it can make a tremendous difference in your income tax. In fact, I've made the statement before, this is probably the second best tax break around. The first is selling a primary residence, and for a married couple filing jointly, up to $500,000 is tax-free of gain on that sale of that residence. For a minister, this is outside of selling a primary residence. This is the best tax break you've got, because it just comes straight off of your taxable income.
And if 100% of it, then it just would act like you didn't get paid anything.
Right. Now, you're still going to have that issue of, have you elected out of Social Security and Medicare?
No, I haven't.
Okay, because housing allowance gets added back to ministerial income for self-employment tax purposes.
So you'd still have to cover that 15%.
Yeah, you still have to cover the 15.3%, but the income tax just goes away.
Okay.
Covering 100% is housing allowance.
It is interesting.
Yeah. All right, other questions, comments? All right, there was a 1988 case, Heritage Village Church and Missionary Fellowship Incorporated. The minister was not allowed a housing allowance since the church paid all his housing expenses and the utilities for the house. Therefore, any housing allowance designated for him exceeded reasonable compensation for the minister. And the issue there, I mean, you can understand the issue. We've got three numbers we're dealing with: how much we designated, how much the fair rental value is, and how much you actually spent. Well, if you actually spent zero, you don't get any housing allowance when you come back to work through the numbers.
So what on his case, is that saying that they paid for all of his cleaning supplies and all that as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything he needed spent, the church paid for.
So he tried claiming a housing allowance after everything had already been paid for him.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, the date of this, 1988, this was after Congress put in the 1971 law, or the 1971 regulations that said it could not exceed your fair rental value number. But before the Warren audit, before the 2002 Housing Allowance Clarification Act. So part of that may have been just the flux in how, they've got Congress or the IRS put in a regulation, but there's no congressional basis for that regulation. So that may have been part of what he was trying to do, was skate around that idea. But I mean, he didn't do a very good job of it if that's what he wanted to do. But all right, my recommendation: it's always better to overestimate your housing cost. And the amount that you designate as housing allowance. Now, obviously, in your case, if your rent exceeds what you're getting paid as a minister, 100%, you can't go any more than 100%. But if housing allowance is not 100% of compensation, it's always better to overestimate what your cost will be. And let's talk through those. And we've got here those three numbers. The housing allowance amount, the fair rental value of the house plus the utilities and actual expenses. So if I pick a big number, say $25,000 for number one, housing allowance, fair rental value is $22,000, and I spend $25,000. The most I get to deduct is $22,000. If I pick a number, 25 for housing allowance, fair rental value is 25, and my actual expenses are 24. I've got $1,000 that I'm going to pick up as additional income. If my W-2, for example, said $30,000 in salary and $25,000 in housing allowance. Box 1, salary of $30,000. Box 14, housing allowance of $25,000. And I only spent $24,000. I'm going to report $31,000 on salary on line 7 of my income tax return. The $25,000 I designated as housing allowance, less the $24,000 I spent. And that extra $1,000 gets added to my salary number of $30,000. You see that?
Yes, sir.
In the earlier case where we talked about I designated $25,000, I spent $25,000, but fair rental value is $22,000. $3,000 will be designated or will be added to my salary amount. So it's always better. You don't want the limiting factor to be how much you designated. If I designate 20 and fair rental value is 25 and I spent 27, the 20 is my limiting factor. Anything, I don't get to take any more reduction of income. So always, to some extent, overestimate what you think you'll spend. However, if you know what your fair rental value is plus the utilities, it's not going to do you any good to go over that unless that number changed through the year. Which brings up an interesting point. You know, if I go in December and designate a number and the community I'm living in just goes crazy as far as, you know, people wanting to live there and the values go up dramatically, the rent value is going to go up. So if I go in later in the year and ask again to my real estate agent friend, you know, what's my rental value now? And they give me a number and it's gone up, that then becomes less of a limiting factor here. And you may at that point in time want to go back and change your housing allowance designation amount. And you can do that on a prospective basis. Okay, so you understand how all the three pieces work together as far as what you get to exclude from income on your tax return.
Yes, sir.
All right. It is possible for a retired minister to designate a portion of his retirement income as housing allowance. It's better if that income comes from a 403B, either 7 or B9 retirement account. A 403B account is similar to a 401k account, except it's run by a nonprofit entity or a government entity or something like that. So a church that has a 403B retirement account for their minister, they can designate a portion of that retirement income as housing allowance. Let's talk about some other, well, before we go there, let's talk about the spouse. The spouse of a deceased minister is not allowed to designate any portion of retirement income as housing allowance. So say he got started paying out from this 403B account and he took a payout where when he passes away, his wife gets 50% or 100% of what he was getting. And he lives for 10 years. And during that 10 years, he designates some portion of that retirement income as housing allowance. That's just fine. And he gets to exclude that from income because it's housing allowance. Now he passes away and his wife starts collecting on that retirement account. Because she was not the minister, she can't designate some portion of that retirement money as housing allowance. And that just makes sense. Now, a retired minister who is getting paid a housing allowance is exempt from Social Security per the Social Security law. Revenue or Internal Revenue Code Section 1402 specifically states that a housing allowance paid to a retired minister is not subject to Social Security income tax or self-employment tax. So we talked earlier about, you know, your housing allowance is added back for purposes of self-employment tax, but a retired minister who's still receiving housing allowance, that is not added back because he is retired. And that's the statement I just made, 1402A8. All right. Any questions?
What about is your moving fees? Is that part of housing allowance, or is that a different?
Now that's a good question. Now we talked about the down payment and any real estate commissions and attorney fees and points on buying a new house, but we didn't talk about anything about the cost to move into that house. I don't know. I don't recall having seen anything in any of the regulations. I mean, my argument would be it's basically about the same thing as all those things related to purchasing a new home, is getting into it. That's a good question. I'll try to do some research on that and see if I can find anything. This is an area that most of the court cases have revolved around the documentation of the housing allowance more so than what they've been claiming. So we have very few court cases that relate to, well, you shouldn't have claimed this. They rarely audit that aspect of it, what you claimed as far as the housing expense. Most of the court cases have revolved around the documentation of it. The designation of the housing allowance prior to it being, designated that way as it was paid to you, etc. So I would argue that that's very similar or basically the same thing as, getting into a new home would include the cost of moving furnishings, etc. And if they're going to pay for me to go buy new furnishings or allow me to exclude buying new furnishings, they should allow me to exclude the cost of getting my existing furnishings into my house. But I'll try to do some research on that and see if I can find anything that's either in regulation or court cases. Anything else?
No, sir.
Well, as we said, there's a lot of things covered here. All your pest control, your household cleaning supplies. If you did a real good job of this, you would have to keep all those receipts. And I've even heard of some ministers that when they go to buy these things like household cleaning supplies, they get one receipt for just those things and they pay separately for other things. So they don't get, confused among, well, here's 15, you went to the grocery store and you just bought groceries. No, I bought things that qualify for my housing allowance and here's the receipt for it. But yeah, it takes some amount of time to document all this and to get it up. And then, as we said, there's three numbers you've got to deal with. How much was designated, how much the fair rental value of the property you furnished with utilities would be, and how much you actually spent. And whichever is the lower of those three numbers is the one you get to use to exclude from income on your tax return. So in a case where you were talking about where your monthly rent on your apartment or house or whatever is more than you get paid for ministerial, designate 100% of salary as housing allowance and just cover it that way. And then
Why do they want the church body, the congregation, to designate an amount?
Because it's a third party that's having to agree to it, gives it more value, more sustainability, reliability than just a minister designating it himself. And whoever's writing the checks needs to understand, because they need to report your salary as housing allowance, or some portion of what they're paying you as housing allowance. So the agreement, the understanding needs to be between the parties, so they, as they're writing your salary check, know how much to designate as housing allowance versus salary. Now, I've heard stories about them giving ministers 2 checks. That's not required. I run payroll for the church, and I designate on their payroll check how much is housing allowance and how much is salary, and that's done based on the agreement between the parties at the beginning of the year, or as it changed throughout the year. So we just, as I process it, and then when I run their W-2s at the end of the year, their salary piece goes in box 1. Their housing allowance I put in box 14. Box 14 is not required to show housing allowance, but it's one of the examples that the IRS uses when they talk about W-2s, about appropriate things to go in box 14. The housing allowance paid to a minister is one of the examples they use. So they're not required to put your housing allowance there, but they shouldn't put it in box 1 as a part of your salary. It should be deducted from box 1, and it should only, if it shows up at all, should only show in box 14 of your W-2. So that's why, yeah, it needs to be a 2-party agreement, and they need to know it and honor it as they are paying your salary. They need to make that separation. Every month, every quarter, when I file quarterly payroll tax returns, I have to make sure that the numbers I report to the IRS only include salary pieces for our ministers, not total compensation we pay them. So as treasurer, am filling out payroll tax forms and W-2 forms and all those sorts of things, I need to know those numbers and know how much they are throughout the year, and quarterly and annually, et cetera, and report them properly. Otherwise, I create problems for myself.
Okay, I got you.
All right, any other questions? Well, I will remind you that next week we have a review and a midterm. My thought right now is that during the class, I will email you the midterm, and you will fill out the midterm test and either scan or take a picture and text or something, get it back to me as during our class period. So we'll spend the first part of the class period doing review, and then we'll spend the last half, you'll do the midterm. Now, the 2 that have chosen not to be with us yet on the live sessions, I'm not sure how we're going to deal with their midterms. I plan to try to communicate with them between now and then and figure that out, and see, they may not be getting a good grade here because they're just not participating. So next week we'll do that review and a midterm, and if you've got recommendations or suggestions for how we handle the midterm, I'll be glad to hear them from you.
I have one question.
Okay.
I know you mentioned that we were all taking it for credit
Uh-huh.
If I clicked on taking it for credit, I made a mistake because I was only wanting to
The audit.
yes. So I might have made a mistake on that. I mean, I love the information. I didn't intend on taking it for credit whenever I.
Okay, is that Justin or Brian telling me this?
It's Brian.
Brian, okay. Let me open up. Justin, you did mark for credit. Let's see here.
Yes, sir.
I'm trying to look back at what Tommy sent me. There's the updated list. Brian, I don't see you on the list that Tommy sent out. Let me. Huh. I don't see you on the list. I'll try to touch base with Tommy Tidwell and make sure what he's got you at. Just to confirm his and my understanding. So I'll do that before I leave here tonight. Just shoot him an email about that. So
Okay. I mean, I don't know. I thought I clicked audit. I'm not,
that's fine. I don't have a problem. I just
but I knew that you had mentioned it, so I just wanted to make sure.
well, yeah, I'm glad you did, and I don't mind you taking the test anyway. But it's totally up to you. If you're willing to, that's fine. This midterm I don't expect to be very difficult, but the final, we'll probably do a similar situation on the final. Although it may be important that it be a proctored exam, so I'll have to talk to Tommy about that issue as well before we get to the final. But I'll ask him about that, and then we'll deal with that issue. And like I say, if you want to take the final next time or the midterm, that's fine. It's up to you. So if you're taking it just as audit, you don't have to take the test. All right. Any other questions?
I'd like to think that I could pass it.
Well, I try not to make it too hard, but I do try to make sure that at least you got a decent understanding of the material.
Well, the reason I did the audit was, Justin just let me know about this whole school a couple months ago, and
Yeah.
yours was one of the very first classes I took, so I wanted to audit it, make sure that I at least agreed with the teaching of the school before I, dove up into credit classes and things.
Okay. Well, a lot of the things that we do are, as you see, we try to record all of them at the Marietta campus. So if you'd like to look at some of the other classes that have gone on or are going on currently, you can look at those Yahoo videos or YouTube videos as well. So that would give you more than just this one class. This is the only class where we really don't get into scripture. I teach Bible class every Sunday, and in fact, this quarter I'm teaching Wednesday night our high school kids. In addition, but this one class we just don't get into scripture. I've contemplated adding a class to this about should the minister be paid as a scriptural discussion, and obviously yes he should. You can't study 1 Corinthians chapter 10 without coming to that conclusion that Paul was very adamant that the minister deserves the right to be paid, to be supported by the congregation that he's preaching for. But yeah, there are other scriptures other than just that would lend support to that. And then we could get into all sorts of discussion about why Paul chose not to get paid. Why he chose to support himself, why he would take from Philippi or some of the other congregations, but not take from Corinth, just issues like that. That I don't know that I know the answers to all those, but yeah. Okay. We'll sign off then, and I'll try to post the recording out there later tonight and send out an email when it's done. All right.
Okay, thank you,
All
sir.
right, thank you, Mr. Roger.
All right. Good night.
Good night.